Yeah, just a very simple example, right? I just showed this book. This is a physical book, a paperback. This is an industrial paradigm product, right? Every book has the same cost. I can't personalize it because you could buy it, Steve, and someone else could buy it, and it's going to be the same book for them, right?
And welcome back to the Money, the Mindset, the Mentoring podcast. Today is for people who are in industries that they see massive disruption happening. If you've got a business, you've been running it for the last 30, 40, 50 years, and you're looking going, oh my God, I'm going to lose my my business to some kid who's in a basement programming some software, and now my business is going to be dead. This podcast is for you because it's all about how do you combat the disruptors in the industry. We've got the man, Rittavan, here. He wrote a book on exactly this, and the book is called Data Impact, How Legacy Businesses Save, Leverage, Align, Simplify, Optimize, Grow to Win. Those are a lot of impactful words to use, my friend. Welcome on the show.
Thanks, Steve. Great to be here.
So I want to talk a little bit about how you really can outpace disruptors, own demand, future-proof your business. I know Peter Drucker once said the purposes of a business is to create and keep customers. But I know right now, after our conversation, it's not really enough. It's not about just keeping customers. It's about owning demand itself. And I know companies like OpenAI, Surreal, NVIDIA, all have really redefined their industries by doing this. So how can you position your business to control demand before somebody else slices your market?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing is understanding if you're a legacy business that you're born and kind of, your value proposition is in the industrial paradigm, right? So let's take this book. To produce it, you're going to have constant replication costs. And if you try to personalize it, let's say you try to write an extra chapter for every person, you'll have constant costs of personalization, right? So most businesses that we're talking about, legacy businesses, have this challenge. Once you move into
Before we jump into that, let's define the term. What is a legacy business?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So for me, a legacy business is essentially a non-software native business and a business that was born before the digital age, and that today is faced with a lot of opportunities that are outside its core sort of approach to providing value to customers.
So this would be like your dentist, your chiropractor, your doctor, your plumber,
mortgage broker,
real mortgage broker, yeah,
financial advisor. It can be anyone. It can be also larger businesses like energy businesses, insurance businesses,
manufacturing,
exactly.
Yeah.
So I would say most industries, except for software and some services that are very new. I think everything else is legacy essentially.
Okay, so if we're looking at those legacy business owners, in one sentence, what could be the biggest mistake that they would make today in innovation?
I mean, one big problem is there's this myth of digital transformation, right? So it's not like your kind of industrial era business is a caterpillar that will turn into a digital butterfly, right? I mean, that's the big problem, right? That's the imagery is wrong. We're not trying to transform anything, right? We're trying to produce value for customers, for existing customers. That's the nice thing. If you're a legacy business, you're not a startup, you have customers. So you want to produce value for them across three paradigms that exist today: the industrial paradigm, the digital paradigm, and the data-driven digital paradigm. And if you think about it, it's, this thing is relatively new, right? So this data-driven digital paradigm kind of emerged over the last decade and a half, right? The digital paradigm is perhaps from the late 90s, mid 90s, and the industrial paradigm has been around, since Adam Smith. And
so if I've been in a, say running a lumber mill for the past 30 years, you've already lost me at the word paradigm. And so let's try to get it so that the average business owner who's producing a hyper performing business, but seeing a lot of armies lining up in the digital space, ready to take their lunch. Let's try to put it in those words. Let's make it simple.
Yeah. So it's about how you provide value and the economics of that, right? So if I provide a physical product, right, then like I said, you're going to have constant costs of replicating that product, right? So if I give you I don't know if I'm a carpenter and I build you a table, if I make you another table, my costs will be will be relatively constant for every table I make. And the costs of personalization are constant, meaning if for you, I write your initials on the table or whatever, and for someone else, I also write their initials. And so in that paradigm, you're very scarcity driven, right? Because you need raw materials. So if you don't have wood, you can't produce tables. If you have a certain amount of wood, you can only produce tables based on the amount of wood you have, etc. All of that changes, right? Because now, if we're talking about digital solutions, you can write software once, you can replicate it as much as you want, right? You have zero costs of replication. There are some costs of personalization, right? So let's say if this lumber company builds a portal, right, for their customers, and they offer them various solutions like configuring products, downstream products like tables or chairs or whatever that they could produce for their customers. All of that is a one-time setup. You don't have additional costs for every customer you try to serve, right? But you have personalization costs if you have someone calling up the customer, speaking with them, or you providing them samples. And then in the data-driven digital paradigm, let's say now you can create the simulation, you can show them things without having to physically produce it. Your personalization costs also go to zero. And that's the big.
So we look at there's two cost things. We're looking at the replication cost, which is just how do you do it over and over again, and then there's the personalization cost, which is how you make it specific to that client. And in this pillar that we're talking about, it's I think you said is the industrial paradigm. Is that correct?
Exactly, right? Which is your classic lumber mill business, right? If Adam Smith were born again today and he saw the lumber mill, he knows exactly what's going on, right? But if Adam Smith sees the customer portal of the lumber mill, he's probably going to have to scratch his head, right? And then if you offer a further data-driven personalization, a portfolio of content, IP, services, etc. around that, personalized to every customer, that's going to be another big jump for him, right? And that's why I mean these are three separate value creation paradigms that need to be understood. Their dynamics need to be understood. And now comes
so we've kind of broken a little bit around the industrial, and we can dive into how to kind of deal with that. What was the second one again? The second one was
just the digital paradigm, like something that's been around now for 25, 30, 35 years.
Okay, so flush that out a little bit more.
Yeah, so I mean, you could, like with software, with any kind of digital content, anything that's digital, that's not physical, right? Your replication costs are the same, right? And that's a big jump. If you think about if I print a brochure as a lumber mill, right? Every brochure has a certain cost. If I have a website, not, like I build it once and I can have N customers come, and then that number N can get bigger and bigger over time and with no additional costs. Right. And so that's a big shift, which means you're not anymore constrained by supply. Right. And if you think about also like the core of the industrial paradigm is a very supply obsessed focused paradigm, because until the end of the Second World War, we had a shortage of stuff, right? That's why everyone was about how do we optimize, how do we produce more, etc. Because when you produce, they would come, they would buy. It's only after the Second World War, that Peter Drucker came up with this idea of, hey, you're here to serve a customer. You're not a lumber mill because you're producing lumber. You're a lumber mill because there's someone buying that lumber from you.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And when you talk about supply, actually, it's interesting with all the stuff that's happening with tariffs and all this other stuff. It's going to really throw a shift into where we are today. What do you think?
Yeah, no, totally. And it's going to be harder, I think, when you're shipping physical goods. But then you can provide, like I said, with the digital and the data-driven digital paradigms, you have the opportunity to provide value to your customers in a way that does not require a physical product, that is not constrained by raw material, by resources, by physical resources. And that's the big shift you need to embrace. And
and that's the third pillar that you talked a little bit about. You said, first of all, you said digital, which, again, like a customer portal or something along that lines. Then the third one was the data driven. Give a little bit more insight into what that looks like.
Yeah, just a very simple example, right? I just showed this book. This is a physical book, a paperback. This is an industrial paradigm product, right? Every book has the same cost. I can't personalize it because you could buy it, Steve, and someone else could buy it, and it's going to be the same book for them, right? If I now put it on Kindle, my replication costs are essentially zero, right? I mean, of course, Amazon is going to take their share and all that for distribution, but like there is no cost of an additional person reading this book. And now if we use the latest LLMs and I kind of train an LLM on the book and on other material that I have, then I can even personalize it. So I could say something like, hey, for a certain price, you could either buy this physical copy, right? Or you could buy it on Kindle, or you could buy it on Kindle with access to a chatbot for 5 questions. And so that's why I mean, like in terms of the value you deliver to your customer is significantly increased with almost no cost to you.
Yep. Yep.
And that's the opportunity. And it's about that, forget transformation.
So what you're saying
that's
is
nonsense.
the legacy business, the businesses that are, sort of steadfast, been around for 30 years, the big missed opportunity that they have, and where these disruptors that are coming in, the disruptors are leading on the data and the digital side, and they're following up with the industrial element, where the industrial companies are going the legacy companies are going the opposite way.
Yeah, I think a big mistake that they're making is, so I think 2 flawed assumptions. One is that you can transform your business somehow into something more digital. Hey, you have an industrial business, it will remain an industrial business. What you need to figure out is how you create value in the new paradigm. So that's a super important misconception that most businesses have, and the winning ones have understood that, right? And then the other one is about, like, the other big misconception is that you can buy, you can consume your way to glory. Like, hey, I will buy a subscription from this and that LLM provider, and now I have AI in my business. Well, there's a really nice anecdote from Charlie Munger about when he and Warren Buffett were sitting, and one of their executives walked in and said, hey, we have found there's a new kind of textile mill that can produce twice as much. It's 2 times more efficient. And the guy thought, these two will be super happy, these 2 gentlemen. And Warren Buffett said, first, let's check if it's true. And if it's true, we're going to exit the textile business. And here's the important insight, right? When there is new technology that makes something efficient, there are 2 winners that come out. One is the vendor, the one that's selling you the machines, right? This new technology, the new subscription or whatever, right? And the other one is the customer, because now you've reduced the barrier to entry and more competitors can enter. You are the one that's getting squeezed. And until you don't understand that, right, you're going to constantly be vendor driven. You're going to be hype driven. You're going to be trend driven. Someone's going to come and sell you something and take you for a ride, for a very long ride, and then you're going to lose. The important thing to figure out here is you need to obsess about your customer, the niche of your customer, and provide your customer value, having understood these new opportunities of servicing and delighting your customer.
It's very interesting that you say that. And I think that's something that I don't want people who are listening to really overstep, is that idea that when some new technology comes in, if I'm understanding right, when some new technology comes in, you're like, sweet, I'm just going to buy that and it's going to make my business more effective. What it's really doing is it's actually diminishing the value that you bring and third partying the value to somebody else, and really reducing the cost of entry to the next person who's going to come in and compete with you.
It's commoditizing your business, right? And it's making it copy paste. I mean, the reason why the margins of industrial businesses are dropping is because they have been increasingly commoditized, and they have been increasingly efficiency and supply focused and not demand focused enough. Let's take the mortgage example, right? Because I think a lot of listeners who have mortgage businesses or real estate brokerage, etc. And I know this for Germany. I don't know it for all markets, but we have comparison portals. Like if you're looking for a mortgage, you go and you put in some details, and then they compare a whole bunch of providers. It's the same for your, for your power or gas or, all the other utility stuff. And what that tells you is that all these businesses, all these legacy businesses have essentially copy-pasted efficiency fixes, technological efficiency fixes, potentially, right? And through that, they've essentially become copy-paste commoditized businesses, which means for me as a user, as a customer, they all look the same. They have not understood demand. They don't stand out, and they have no relationship with me as a customer. And that is exactly what you don't want. Because think on the other extreme about luxury, right? Like Louis Vuitton or Rolex, these are all handmade products, supposedly, right? But that's why people are paying for them. So the people are not buying these because they're super efficient, or like these guys have insanely automated production processes. They're buying this because they've understood demand. They're offering you something that you value, that you're willing to pay that money for.
Yeah, I mean, they play the scarcity game, whether it's actual or artificially created.
Yeah,
There's a
or in
scarcity.
yeah, or just happiness. It's not. I mean, yeah, it's scarcity, but it's also this feeling of something special. And the more you can give the customer that feeling, the happier they are. And a classic example is airlines, right? Like, let's say the legacy part of the airline business, which is taking us from point A to point B, that does not make any money anymore. I mean, it's at best like single digit profit margin, and at worst, they're losing money on every flight. But you still have airlines around, not just because it's critical, for transport, but the way they're really making money, like essentially all their enterprise value is their loyalty program. Right? And if you think about it, what's the loyalty program? Loyalty program is customers you've acquired with your traditional legacy product, but that you're providing value through a whole bunch of new stuff in a data-driven way that you couldn't have done before. And so the loyalty program moves away from being just a retention mechanism to the core revenue and almost the only profit generating source to your business.
Yeah, that is so super interesting when you look at that, because you're absolutely right. Really, they're just a Conestoga wagon in the air, and that's getting devalued, and profits are getting eaten by carbon tax credits and all these other things. And to find a way to make a move into either the digital or the data paradigm, they've definitely moved in the digital paradigm, and then most certainly have moved into the data paradigm.
Yeah, I mean, you saw this, during the pandemic where the three biggest US airlines were able to take loans, big loans, based on the value of their loyalty programs, right? The airlines are a bank essentially, right? They're issuing miles and they're exchanging those miles for hard cash, right? With their bank partners, their insurance partners, with whoever else. And we're totally fine with that. If you think about it, you could also price compare for airlines. So like go to a portal, compare the prices and buy your tickets every time with a new airline. That would be the cheapest. That's exactly how you would look for a mortgage. That's exactly how you would look for your utility companies, etc. Because why shouldn't it become commoditized? The reason it's not is because they have miles, right? Now you get lounge access, you get upgrades, you can buy additional travel insurance, you get a credit card, you can collect points on that credit card, exchange it for miles. So like there's this whole bunch of additional value they give you, and also that gamification and that feeling of I'm part of something. I got my Amex Platinum business card the moment I set up my business because uh, even though it costs me, $700 a year, I love that moment when I walk into the lounge, right? And it might not even pay off financially, but it's that feeling of, hey, I can grab a coffee here now. I can have a meal, just before I board my aircraft. And so earlier you had food on every flight, you had pretty decent food. I remember as a kid flying in the 90s, and, now it's like taking a bus, right? Like there's absolutely no feeling of something premium, and yet it's expensive. And so you have to provide that feeling, that value somewhere else.
Yeah, and I definitely think, I mean, I look at I always think there's four reasons people buy, and they buy because they have a pain, they buy because there's an opportunity, they buy because there's a community, or they buy because they get elevated status. And each of those get hit by exactly what you've just said is, number one, trying to find a seat or even get a coffee in that huge lineup out in the main area stinks. So you're like, I can just go to the lounge and it's quiet. I always have a place to sit and there's some food out, coffee, and it's a higher level of just people that generally hang out in that lounge, and you can network whatever if that suits your fancy. Or you can just go to sleep and it's great. And then the community is absolutely, you're now a part of the elite status. And that kind of not only gives a community, but a greater, higher feeling because you feel elite because they've told you that. So I think that definitely is very interesting. Now I want to pivot, and I want to move into the book itself and talk a little bit about SLA SOG, so SlashOg, which is save, leverage, align, simplify, optimize, grow. And what sparked the idea for that framework?
Yeah, that's based on, more than a decade operating across multiple legacy industries, both in like old companies, over 100-year-old businesses, as well as startups and scale-ups in these industries. And what I was kind of reflecting on is like, hey, what's the difference from first principles, that if you reverse engineer success, right? What are some of these businesses doing right that others are not? And that took me very quickly to the fundamentals, like really a first principles fundamental understanding of how value creation works and why we're doing, like, why do you even exist? And that's how SlashOg was born. And so SlashOg, in 6 sentences, is a 6-step framework And the 6 sentences are, save money by basically not doing stupid stuff, right? Which is not doing, groupthink, right? Because you just kind of say, oh, let's look at best practices. Let's see what the lumber mill around the corner is doing and someone else. And then you just try to apply that. And that's a very supply focused thinking, because you need to care about your customers. Your customers are not the same as someone else's customers around the world or somewhere else, right? You need to focus on that. And the second
And you
step is,
definitely did talk in the book about avoiding groupthink and spotting opportunities. What's a recent example of a company that did that and front ran a disruptor pretty well?
you mean that didn't fall to groupthink?
Correct.
Yeah, so I mean, let's take the utilities business, because I think that's an example of how commoditized this has become, how copy paste all of them look, right? Like, usually don't see any difference between two utilities. And I have a playbook of a very successful business in the UK. It's about a decade or so old. And what they did was say, look, at the end of the day, the energy grids need to be balanced, and they work with basically, you have to balance supply and demand, so the frequency of the energy grid stays the same. And how most utilities do it, there's a market mechanism where the traders trading this in real time. I was a trader at the start of my career in the energy markets, in the power markets. And then, there's like people basically hedge those risks and sell the stuff off. What these guys did is said, look, we will let you know what the real time energy price is. Right? And if you support us by matching your consumption pattern to that price, we will give you the benefit. We will pass on the benefits of adapting your consumption, your user behavior to the needs of the grid. And so you're removing this whole bunch of other market participants that are essentially managing supply and demand, that risk in real time. And you're just bringing the customer straight to the power plant in some ways, right? And you're giving them that, you're just providing that value to them. And now suddenly this is unique. This does, like, no utility does this. This is completely unique. And so, like, if I am now looking for an option for my power contract, it's either Octopus Energy in this case, like the ones who've implemented this playbook, or everyone else, right? Everyone else is one category now. They're standing out.
So that makes them stand out in that standing out and not following the group think. They become the sort of is albatross. They become the thing that people look at.
Yeah, another example, right? There's a regional mutual insurer. So, like, they're owned by the guys who own the insurance policy. So it's not a listed company. It's a very, what you would think, almost like a cooperative, right? In the agriculture sector. So, like, the owners of the insurance policies basically own this company. It's a regional insurer in Germany. They completely dominate the motor vehicle insurance market, the online motor vehicle insurance market. And the way they did that was with a clear vision. They said, we're here to offer you a personalized insurance machine that is digital, that's easy to use, and that is competitive in terms of prices. And so, like, if you look at their premiums versus anyone else in the market, they're like miles away from everyone else. So, like, if I'm buying insurance for my car, it's like a complete no-brainer, because either I take what they offer, or I pay 50-60% more.
Yep. Yep.
And the way they do that is just, they're completely digital. Like, if anyone's lived in Germany, you keep getting letters in your post from all your insurance providers, etc. That's extremely annoying. And what these guys have, they have email addresses for everyone, because from the moment they started, they do not send you stuff by post. They don't do stuff manually. That just saves a whole bunch of costs on the supply side. And then on the demand side, they are not on any portal. They don't go on a comparison portal, because what they're saying is, hey, if you want to buy from us, you buy from our homepage, right? And otherwise, just go and buy any of the other guys that are so much more expensive and that are completely copy paste, right?
Yep. Yeah, and that makes them stand out. And it goes down to the idea of owning demand. And so if we're gonna, what does owning demand mean? Sort of in a practical terms perspective. We've talked a lot about big businesses, but I want to talk about mid-sized business or even small businesses. What does owning demand mean, and how could they start that process today?
Yeah, let me use the second step in the framework, which is leverage, right? So you need to think from first principles what your strengths are. And so if you're a mid-sized business, right, and let's say you have a physical presence, or you have a store, right, that customers can come into, or you have an office, or you have a warehouse or whatever, right? Then leverage that from a data-driven perspective, right? Because you can now offer you can offer a physical in-person experience that a pure play digital player cannot. So if you if you obsess about that, understand what your customers need, what would they need to experience in person to buy. And I guess you would know this from the real estate industry, right? A lot of people try to get rid of brokers. The thing is, at the end, a human being that's buying a house, that's such a big commitment, wants another human being beside them. It's just an emotional thing. You don't have a broker with you because they know something about the market or the asset necessarily that that's way deeper than what you know. It's just that it's like with an aircraft, right? I mean, most aircrafts today could fly without a pilot, right? But would you enter an aircraft without a pilot as a human being, right? There are cargo flights that have already taken place completely without humans, in the cockpit. And so I think
And
understanding
do you
this,
think there'll be a time where that barrier will be surpassed?
yeah, but it's not tomorrow. I think, and it's not. I don't think it's the next decade either, right? And so I think the point is, the ideas in the book are those that are going to bring you value for the next decade at least, and that will compound value, right? We'll cross that bridge when we get there. I think a lot of people, I just look at news articles from 2015, 16. Like there were things like, oh, we're going to have self-driving cars by 2017 or by 2018, 2019. I never did. I didn't bother to do my driving license until 2 years ago, when I was fed up with this nonsense, because people kept promising all kinds of nonsense. And once you understand, right, the algorithms and the math and how this works, we're far away from this, right? People are trying to sell you stuff or are trying to, pump up their stock prices. And so that's their game. That's okay. But you need to be smart about this as a consumer and say, look, this is too futuristic and this is not how it's going to work.
Well, I
And
think,
focus on what
when we
works
look
now.
at the mortgage broker or the pilot, I think I fundamentally believe the reason why people want to have a person and not just work with AI or, automatic flight situation is because they want that accountability, that person who's there with them, that shares the moment with them. I listened to this one little short that talked about why people get married, and it's not out of love or anything, but it's out of the idea that you have a witness to your life. And having somebody in the mortgage process that's a witness to the process and an accountability to the process, and sort of they get preserved through the process. They benefit from the process. They're tied to the success of the process. Obviously, in somebody who's flying the plane, if the plane's going down, the captain's going down with it too. And so they're tied to the success of the flight. So I think when it's AI or some sort of computer algorithm that's flying the plane or driving the mortgage process, they don't get that same experience. They don't get that same connection to an individual who's connected to the result.
Yeah, it's ownership, it's skin in the game, right? It's also understanding emotions, right? I think the most important thing is the fear, right? Human understanding another human's fear, right? The concerns, the stories, the narratives, these are all things that are very person specific. And that's where we shine, right? As human beings is on two things. Is one, on creativity that is like specific to a situation, not like general creativity, like write me a poem. I think that an LLM can already do pretty good, but like creativity targeted in a certain context. So understanding, reading that context, reading other humans, right? And the other thing is abstracting out from a real life situation and looking at it analytically, right? Having like optimizing the decision logically. These are two things I think that for the longest time I think are not going to go away. Like algorithms, just structurally the way currently the models work and the way math works, it's not something that's going to change overnight.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. And I kind of want to pivot into the next element, which is the idea of data and how we leverage data, shape and expand demand. I know you emphasize the importance of building an empirically valid worldview to break that out into a way that the listeners could understand who might not be into deep data. Talk a little bit more about that and expand on what that means to have a empirically valid worldview.
So there's a very nice example of this, from the Second World War. When the Americans entered the war, they would bomb during the day. So the Brits would bomb at night because, anti-aircraft fire was, it was much harder to spot aircraft. So it's actually safer to bomb at night, but then you're less accurate in terms of hitting targets. And the Americans came in and said, no, we're going to bomb during the day because we want to hit our targets. We want to make sure we've hit those targets, and all that goes with that. And so there's a new series on Apple, right? So you kind of, it's been kind of almost recreated that period, and super fascinating to see how that worked. But like what happened there was you had these young boys getting into these flying these bombers, and the flak jackets and the parachutes of that time were so big that you couldn't have both, right? So you could either wear a flak jacket with metal plating, etc. So it was bulky, it was heavy, or you could take a parachute along. And the implication from here is if you're hit from anti-aircraft fire, shrapnel, other fighter jet fire, etc., then the flak jacket is going to save your life. And if the plane goes down, that's when the parachute is useful. And so if you think about it logically, right, it's true they lost a lot of bombers at the start, right? But as they got better, as the intelligence was better, the equipment was better, most of the time, your guys got shot because they were not wearing a flak jacket. And so the logical thing was, you're more likely to be shot at and get home than have your aircraft crash. Because otherwise it would just not be, you can't lose an aircraft every sortie, right? So obviously, and so it was at about 70-30. Let's say 70% of the time, you come home, but you've been shot at and you probably die from those wounds, or you die on spot, right? 30% of the time you might have to bail, or there's a serious aircraft damage. And so, the US Army Command saw this, they collected all this data, and they told the pilots, hey, you need to take the flak jacket, that's going to save your life. What do you think the boys did? What do you think the airmen did in this situation?
They took the flak jacket, or did they get the parachute?
They did 70-30, right? So they figured out roughly that they probability matched, right? So what they did is 70% of the time I'm going to get hit by shrapnel, 30% of the time my plane is going to be shot down. And so every sortie they would randomize and say, okay, with I toss a coin, that's 70% heads that I take the flak jackets, 30% I take the parachute. Which, if you think from an empirically valid point of view, every sortie is independent, right? Every of those anti-aircraft guns is independent. So like every time you get into the aircraft, do a mission and come back, each mission is independent, right? So there is absolutely no reason to randomize. It's very clear, always with a 70% chance, you're going to be shot at. And so which is much higher than 30, right, of having the entire plane fall down. So just wear the damn flak jacket, right? But
because then also, if you get the plane shot down, you get the parachute. Where are you landing? Behind enemy lines by yourself. And now you got a whole new sort of problems. Let's just take that flak jacket.
Yeah, exactly. But, these guys were randomizing, and there's been a lot of behavioral research, right, around what's going on. And this is not just human. You see this across goldfish, monkeys, even ants. And so what this means is that this is an evolutionary response, right? As species, we survive nature and change on our planet because we were never sure exactly, like we didn't have a empirically valid model of our world. We didn't have the compute. We didn't have the energy, the resources to understand our environment well enough that we could optimize. And so we would randomize to survive. Right? So think of a bird, right? You could lay an egg, you could lay your eggs, right? Your nest, you could do that in the valley or on the top of the mountain. And suppose you had a lot more food in the valley than, on the peak where there's only snow. Then you would just always go, every bird, every generation would just lay their eggs in the valley. The problem is if there's a crazy flooding one time or a forest fire, then the entire species gets wiped out. So probability matching is a survival mechanism, like randomizing is the survival mechanism. So the point is, in the current business setting, right, we understand, like you have everything you need to understand your environment. You have data, right? You can experiment. If you don't have data, you can collect data. You have compute. Compute is cheap, right? So it's not just about buying the latest AI solution. It's about thinking from first principles, understanding the environment you understand in, leverage data, math, right? And logically do the optimal thing possible. Because now let's look at two scenarios, right? So like, let's say along with the US Army, Air Force, there was another Air Force fighting the Second World War. And let's say they both had limited number of pilots. The guys that were randomizing and probability matching versus the guys that always took the flak jacket, at the end of the war, they would have probably, they have an exponentially higher number of pilots left versus the other guys.
So you're saying that the randomized would have more than the flak jacket people?
No, the randomized would die out much faster.
I was going to say, I was thinking.
Yeah. No, the randomized would die out a lot more, right? So they would get wiped out almost compared to the guys who are doing the right, the mathematically optimal, empirically valid thing.
But if you're absent of an empirically valid view, the randomization allows you to experiment to be able to create that empirically valid view.
Yeah, I mean, that's a process, right? And so, I mean, the fact that I said 70-30, you don't know 70-30 at the outset, but very quickly, the moment you figure out, okay, each sortie is independent, right? That once you model the problem correctly, very quickly, you have enough data to start optimizing, right?
I believe the human condition that poses a challenge against this. And listeners, this is probably one of the things to really think about when you're looking at when you make your own decisions. How many times do we make a decision that is emotional that we justify with empirically valid data that validates our emotional decision?
Yeah, but I mean that's a known bias, right? And that's exactly why I wrote this book. Is we need, like, if you don't address that, right, what you're essentially doing is you're doing copy paste like everyone else, right? So you're doing the same, because we're all wired as a species in a very similar way, right? So if you do probability matching, so you say, oh, let's think of a couple of data use cases, and then I'm going to put in a bit of money in all of them, and then hope something works out. So this kind of spray and pray problem that you see, and everyone's
Mhm.
doing that, and everyone's ending up in disaster, right? So you have 90% failure rates for digital transformations, because decidedly because people are doing completely logically flawed stuff, right? On the other side, you have a few winners. You have some people who are just doing it right, and the difference between them is they're making the right decision. They're not letting evolutionary instincts or behavioral biases dictate important decisions, right? It's all
Yeah,
about
and
that.
and that's where I think, as a species, we suffer a little bit because I think a lot of times our emotions will take over and we make emotional decisions, we make irrational decisions. But if we would lead with the empirical data, that's going to help us. In transitioning that into connecting data with demand, companies like OpenAI or Netflix, it's not that there was like a demand, somebody saying, oh, gee, I want to have this LLM that's out there. They didn't respond to it. They actually shaped demand. Now we can see that on a massive scale with massive R&D budgets. Awesome. But if you're a small business, how do you do this demand shaping without those massive R&D budgets?
Yeah, so let's just take the example of a mortgage broker, right, or a real estate broker. So now you have a small brokerage, perhaps with half a dozen people. Where you should start is your customer demand. Understand who are your customer, like what's unique about your customer demand, right? Then look at your legacy assets, right? So your legacy physical assets, or what I would call your unfair non-digital advantage. You have locations that, if you look at it from a pure play online world, or your balance sheet does not look great, but if you look at it from a data driven perspective, you can understand your customers in the physical world the way that pure play online player will never be able to. So leverage that from a data driven perspective. um, and then then think about productization. So take what you're offering as a service, etc., leverage that by trying to standardize it as much as possible, and making the personalization as data driven and as algorithmically driven as possible. And now you can counter position. So now you tell your customers, I am providing you something that's unique, because the pure play online player is just competing on price. They're competing on one dimension. You're competing, now providing something that's not commoditized, and now suddenly they're not price comparing anymore. So you need, and this is only possible in the data driven paradigm, right? It wasn't really possible earlier. It wasn't possible to scale it. Now you can understand your customers in ways that you've never, that was not possible before. You can personalize your offering in ways that was not possible before.
Yeah, I
And
think
then you
that's
need to align, right? Align all your investments, align your teams, align everything to that. Because once you've got this insight and then you start implementing it, but it's all spread out, no one knows what's going on, there's no clarity, then that's not going to work. And then alignment is also data driven, right? So one, you need to have a clear North Star metric, right? This is something from the startup world that I think legacy businesses can and should use. Like, know why you exist, know why you wake up every morning, right? Have a clear way to quantify the value you deliver to your customers. Again, data driven. You couldn't have done it at scale, right? You couldn't have done it in a rigorous way earlier. Now you can do that. All the software companies that have scaled so well have followed this. Then have a clear commander's intent. Make sure everyone understands not just like your roadmap or a set of tasks, right, but understands why you're doing it, and under what assumptions you're doing it, and what do you want to achieve, right, overall. And that, again, now that commander's intent can be fleshed out using metrics that matter, right? So define like data driven metrics for each of these components. So it's a lot more rigorous, it's a lot more empirical, and then that allows you to align your teams, because you don't have to micromanage them anymore. You don't have to tell people what to do. They don't have to ask for your approval, because you've aligned them to what you want to achieve, and that thing better be leveraged, right? So you've found your leverage stuff, you've aligned everyone. Now you can simply simplify, which is throw out the clutter, right? Do not keep the clutter, because if you keep the clutter, it's like putting sand in your gears, right? Like you want to put engine oil in there. You want that thing to be smooth, right? Any clutter, any other distractions, any other nonsense is just going to slow it down and potentially collapse the thing. And now you can optimize, right? Because now you have these gears, they're turning smoothly, you've got nice momentum. Now you can optimize it. Very important. It should be empirically valid, right? If you're making wrong assumptions about the world and then trying to optimize, you're going to die, right? So you want to make the right assumptions and then you want to optimize, right? Those two things go together. And like you said, you have to experiment, right? So make a set of assumptions. And like this chapter has a whole bunch of questions, because I can't give you a recipe, right? I don't even know what your problem is. So how do you want me to help you solve? And so what I try to do is I give you questions that help you frame the problem, that help you better understand the problem, a whole set of questions. And with that, you can take any problem and try to spec out a way to solve it. And that's again data driven, and that's with compute and with data and with rigorous thinking. That was like data and compute was expensive earlier. You had to do it on your pocket calculator. There are things today that you can compute that you could never have done before, right? Just in terms of possibilities. And so do that, because if you don't do that, someone else might in your market, and then they're going to have that nice exponential curve and you're going to be flat, right? Or almost flat.
And that's to me is such a beautiful rundown on your save, leverage, align, simplify, optimize, grow, in how a small business can pivot their mindset to be able to include that in the way that they orient their business at the principles level, so then the mechanics can just follow suit.
Yeah, and let's come to grow. I think this is a very, like, if you do all of this and then you don't understand grow properly, it wouldn't have been worth it. And the thing with grow is just shed your scarcity mindset, right? Because let's look at the airline. Let's say an airline has 50 aircraft and another airline has 100 aircraft. The airline with 50 aircraft can grow, can grow independent of those aircraft, because once they have acquired those customers via the aircraft business, right, with their loyalty program, with other solutions, they can scale the value they deliver, like completely independently of the physical resources. And it's the same in whatever you're doing. Think about, like, forget the resource constraint. Think about your customers. Think about the customers that exist. Think about potential customers you can get, and think how you can drive that word of mouth. Like, how can you delight your customers 10x more, so that they go and speak about it? And you can do that in a data-driven way. You can partner with people. You can use services. You can use IP. You can use content. You can use a whole, physical products. You can use a whole bunch of stuff. You can put it all together. And I think there are two structures to keep in mind, right? One is like understand your funnel, right? It's so basic, but most people just don't do it. Like, understand your funnel in the most granular way possible. Like, understand the atomic revenue, unit of revenue, and the atomic unit of profit, right? What's the smallest indivisible unit? And then try to map that to to the value you deliver to your customers. And then build your flywheel, right? One is about getting customers to you, and the other one is like spinning your flywheel, because it's not complicated, right? Most people, like, they want it cheaper, they want more of it, they want more options, they want it faster. It's a few fundamental things, as you said, right? It's not, this is not rocket science, but like, understand which of these is important and in what order, right? And let's like try to figure that out. And you can do that now with data. You can do that with understanding customer behavior. You can do that with speaking to your customers, right? So there's a whole bunch of ways to get there. And then spin that flywheel, because if you spin that flywheel, that is what compounds, right? That's like when that's where you're invested in a highly leveraged bet that's optimized, and that is what drives growth over a decade.
Yep. Now, when we look at all of it, and we look at each of the SlashOg framework, which is the most overlooked element that founders or entrepreneurs or legacy business owners miss in this process if they want to really be successful? What's the biggest one that make the most mistake?
I think each of them, like, there are parts that they're missed, but I think the most important thing is like get your leverage right? If you want, because if you can do everything else, like you can align, you can simplify, but if you're doing it on the wrong stuff, right, then the whole thing is not going to work anyway. So you need to get your leverage. Like, your leverage is something you absolutely need to get right, and then the rest is is like scaling and enhancing that, and making sure the idea.
When you say get the leverage wrong, when they don't get it right, be a little bit more specific.
Yeah, I mean, just think about it, right? Like, if you have a manufacturing company, let's say with 500 employees or 1,000, what would you do? Like you'd say, oh, okay, we've heard about this thing called AI and whatever, and this is going to change the world. So let's do a all hands event where we brainstorm, and then your accountant comes up with a data use case and AI use case, and then your marketing person comes up with that, and then your engineer comes up, and then you kind of put all of those in an Excel sheet, and then God knows how you prioritize this nonsense, and then you say, let's do 5 things out of this, right? So let's make sure we take one from marketing, one from engineering, one from supply chain, and one from HR, just to keep them happy. But hey, what nonsense is this? Like, this is not, your customer does not care. Like, firstly, it's not bringing any value to them, right? This whole way of thinking is completely absurd, right? Like, and so forget all of that. Understand what are those 2 or 3 things that matter to your customer, right? And that are unique to you in terms of like your custom, like not the customer or a customer in the market, but your unique demand and your unique assets, right? Because leverage needs both. You need to leverage your assets to serve your demand, right?
So really what you're bringing out, which is very much, I would say, a late 90s sort of en vogue principle, which was that customer-centric approach.
It's still, I mean, it's still customer centric, but I think the big difference with what I'm suggesting here is like leveraging your physical assets, leveraging all the stuff that a typical software company would say is bad. We celebrated all these companies that scale, that are asset light, right? Like an Uber, like an Airbnb, like an Amazon to some extent. I mean, they do run very complex supply chains, but like they didn't have a physical store, right? So we said, oh, Walmart is going to get wiped out, right? Because everyone's going to just order online. It's so much cheaper, it's more convenient, etc. Walmart is still around, and I think that's another playbook I explore in the book, which is that as long as they were price competing or didn't stand out from the crowd, it was then you'd anyway go to an Amazon. Over the last couple of years, they got in Seth Dallaire as, I think, CRO now, Chief Growth Officer, and what they've built 3 data-driven businesses. Which is Walmart Plus, which is their subscriptions. They have another business where the way they understand how a customer is behaving in the store is unique. Only they know that. Like, that's something that Amazon will never know, because Amazon does not have stores, right? So you leverage the customer experience, you leverage your demand in stores, in your physical assets. So you leverage your physical assets from a data-driven perspective. This is different, right? None of these software playbooks, none of this, oh, let's obsess about customer stories, understand that aspect, because they're operating in an asset free, asset light world. And my focus is, how do we help the guys with physical assets? How do we help the people who have all this legacy brands? How do they leverage that? How do you take the trust that your grandparents built over the last 100 years in the business that you now run, right, as a second generation family business owner? How do you leverage that? How do you combine that, right, with your unique customer demand? How do you obsess and focus on that? How do you not, how to basically not copy paste and commoditize yourself like almost everyone else unfortunately has done?
Yep.
That is unique, I think, because it's kind of putting these elements together. Because customer obsession is not new, right? Like you said, this is, and now the other interesting thing is, why is that important, right? Because if you think about, let's say you drive your car, right? The experience of your car is multi-dimensional, right? Which is the music quality, like firstly, how does it feel, in terms of the steering, the brake, the acceleration, but also the music quality, the air, the conditioning, all of that, the design, all of these things play a role, right? So a physical product is typically a multi-dimensional experience, multi-sensory. Now think about any software you use, right? That's a linear user journey, which means if the average experience of your user journey is good, right? But right at the start, I annoy you so badly because you have to click 100 different things, you will never experience the average journey, right? And this where brings me back to the book, which is, this is a physical product. I can't change it once it's shipped, right? Like every industrial product. But if you read this book, right, this is a user journey. It's a physical product, but you're going to read one page. You can't read 3 pages in parallel. You're going to read 1 page at a time, right? Which means I have to craft a physical product with a digital style user journey. Because at any point you're focused on that. So if my introduction and first chapter are awful, but the rest of the book is amazing, you will never experience the rest. Like, you will never experience the average book. You experience the book in a linear way, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
You need to craft your like, it's a physical book, but I've crafted it in a way, and I've tested it, with multiple rounds with beta readers, etc. in a way that I know, okay, at no point is this experience dropping so low that the person puts the book away.
And I'm excited to get feedback from the readers, guys. The last thing I want to talk about is alignment and how you sustain demand once you've captured it. Now, I know you highlight alignment as a core step in the SlashOg process. How do leaders keep alignment when everyone's chasing quarterly results or the latest and greatest new shiny tool?
Yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward. I think this is like people overcomplicate this. I think it's pretty straightforward. Be clear about it, right? I mean, go and read Jeff Bezos's letters, from 2000, whatever, 3 or something. He's telling you very clearly, screw the next quarter. Like, I'm not bothered and you shouldn't be bothered. Otherwise, don't invest with me, right? That's something that Warren Buffett has been saying. I have the playbook of a German platform in mortgages, insurance, etc. They completely dominate the market. This is an entrepreneur who did he did a little leveraged buyout in his early 20s, and he's compounded on, double-digit growth rates, and he's never paid a dividend because he's like, I don't care. If you buy my stock, you're buying it because you want to hold it for the next 10 years. I'm not interested in the rest. And he didn't pay himself out, and his entire net worth is basically in his company, and that is what matters, right? And now I think that's where you see kind of where you start doubting the intention of founders. You see that a lot, unfortunately, in Silicon Valley, right? We essentially turning their companies into shell companies for fundraising because they're spreading peanut butter all over, right? They're doing a whole bunch of things that is completely irrelevant to the company, and you're like, why do you still exit it and do whatever you want, right? But like, this is your fiduciary responsibility. You need to be completely aligned and you need to communicate that alignment. And then once you do that, it's a commitment, it's a positioning, right? Which means you attract investors to you that are also aligned with that, right? You're not looking for people who are trying to trying to buy and flip your stock every 3 months. You're attracting people who buy into your vision, right? Who are willing to do that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
I
and I
think
think,
that is
it
important.
all goes down to sort of the difference between, as you said, spreading peanut butter everywhere or like an all-in focused. And we look at something like NVIDIA, and they've really had an all-in focused. When we talk about the equivalent of focus for like a service business, what would that be when they're trying to own their niche?
I think I'd say like start with a North Star, right? Like quantify the value you deliver to your customers, like put a number on it and like have a mechanism to measure it and put a number on it and quantify it. Because if you don't do that, like we're talking abstract stuff, right? Because if you think about services, right, there is no real production cost except, the time that people put in, right? So like there's no raw materials that help you kind of compute a gross margin or something. So then, the supply side again is not something that you can really optimize in like financially really quantify. So what matters is like, how do you measure the value delivered? And that's something you can then try to maximize over time. And then how you drive alignment is through intent, right? So like, and there was this, I think it was HubSpot's head of marketing in Europe or something like that, who posted this, like she flies Ryanair regularly, right? They're based in Ireland. And she has a kind of, business person, compact suitcase that you can just, you don't have to check in and you can just, keep take into the aircraft with you.
It's got to be this small if it's on Ryanair, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, no, I mean, it's got, it's whatever. Like they have their standard size. She made sure she bought that. She's
Flying
flown,
Ryanair.
but she's flown frequently with them. And
I actually liked Ryanair. I flew it a bunch of times.
yeah, no,
Except that when I flew into Germany, I
yeah,
thought I was flying into Frankfurt because it said Frankfurt Hahn Airport,
mhm,
but it actually landed in Hahn, which is some ridiculous amount of hours away from
far
Frankfurt.
away.
I'm like, this is not really Frankfurt.
Yeah,
And
that
yeah.
that cheap ticket has to that they have to cut costs somewhere, right? But like,
Yeah, well, they cut costs for them, but the 3 or 4 hours I was on the Autobahn, and that's when I was driving the Autobahn, and I'm whipping down the highway. I'm like, this is the Autobahn. There's no speed limits. And
yeah.
then I went through the town or whatever, and I had these little circles with the 70, 80, 100. And I'm like, and I'm doing 200 and something going through it. And then somebody tells me later, no, that was the speed limit. I was like, I thought that was just like a suggestion.
For most of it, yes, except when you're going close to towns, I think they,
Yeah, it was through the town. I guess it was not a suggestion, but I was very lucky that time. And then every exit it said Ausfahrt, and I'd always giggle. Yeah.
No, but I think the important thing here is, if you don't have a clear intent of why every person in your business is around, right, then you'll have wrong incentives if you try to do metrics driven, like, the wrong kind of metrics driven incentive and management. And like this example is, someone had a quota to fulfill, like they had to make a certain amount of revenue by finding customers. And so they told this lady, oh, your suitcase is like, 1 centimeter too big. You need to pay, I don't know, a huge fine, 60 euros or 70 euros, something like that, which would have probably been the price of the ticket. And
Totally.
she was
It's happened to me
furious.
before.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
what
it's
she
awful.
said is, my customer value to Ryanair, right? I fly frequently. I fly almost all the time with them, right? And I've been flying for a decade. I will fly for the next decade. With that 170 euro, 70 euro or dollar revenue, they have destroyed that trust, right? And this is something you see I experienced this in India once when I was visiting family. I was sitting in the bank. We're trying to open we're trying to open a locker in the bank or trying to get a service, a specific kind of product from them. They're pushing all kinds of other products to you because that's their target, right? So like they've been told, hey, you need to do this. And that's where alignment is so critical, because if you even if you're data driven, right, but you're not aligned to the value you deliver, you're going to destroy customer trust, you're going to destroy customer relationships, and you're going to where we were sitting with these guys and we said, hey, we are asking you for a specific product, give it to us now. And they said, but that's going to take time, why don't you come back tomorrow? And at the same time, they're trying to force other products on us which we don't even want, right? And it's the same example with Ryanair here, where you destroy destroy compounded value and trust with your customer for some stupid target that you're trying to hit.
But there's a balance between cost and satisfying the customer, because I forget who it was who said it. They said the customer isn't always right. Your shareholders are right in the sense that you're there to drive a profit. And if you have to balance profit and customer, does it come in how that you structure that relationship?
It's how you quantify, right, your North Star metric, because it has to take into account all these nuances. And that's why your North Star metric is not, it's not just your revenue or your profits or something financial. It's not something that you would report, right, in a financial statement. It's something that's more subtle. And again, there also, it's about experimenting, but like don't change it every day. Keep it for a year, or two, grow with that, fine tune it at some point. And so, but if you don't have that, North Star, if you don't align people to something, right, and with a clear intent, right, so it can be something like, hey, you have your daily target or your quarterly target, but like not at the cost of destroying the relationship with a frequent flyer, right? Like, for heaven's sake, don't do that, because it wouldn't have been worth it, right? And so basically, you're trying to set a target, you're trying to perhaps increase your profit margin, but at the cost of destroying a lot more profit. And so that's what I mean, like empirically valid, data driven, like understand what you're like, the value you're offering, and make sure you make the right decisions, and your organization has understood what the right decision means, right, in that context.
And that goes down, and it's one of the things that could obviously kill a company is throwing out 1,500 new metrics that they're going to now track. And I know you're often quoted talking about simplifying as a superpower.
Okay.
How can a founder know what to simplify and, what to dive deep or not touch?
Yeah, and that's why the order, right? So that's why I start with leverage, right, which is like understand the key drivers, and there are not 100 of them. They're like 1, 2, 3. You can count them on your fingers, right? So like pick those, then align everything to those, right? That already clears out, that clears out most of the clutter. There isn't that much left, right? And then of course there is a bit of, and that's what I mean, like I can give you a first principles framework, right, to run you, like to succeed in the data driven age. What I can't give you is a cookbook where you close your eyes and just follow a recipe, right? Because if that were possible, that means entrepreneurship could be a recipe. If entrepreneurship is a recipe, we don't have capitalism anymore. So like logically, I can't do that, right? But what I can give you is this framework. And if you think about it, and there's no perfect answer, right? It's all about trying, experimenting, etc. But at least what I do is I remove 90% of the clutter on the table, so that you have that 10% that you can focus your bandwidth on, and you can really, like, that's the high leverage stuff, because the rest you throw away. What most people do is, without this understanding, you end up spreading your peanut butter across the entire table, right? What I'm saying is 90% of the stuff on the table does not matter, like just does not matter.
You have some strange friends if they're just spreading peanut butter everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's
I like peanut butter, banana, slice of bread. We're good.
yeah.
I'm simplifying there, Rittavan. Now, if somebody's listening and realizing they've been playing defense in their business, what's one thing they can do to actually get into the offense and start reclaiming demand? One thing, short sentence.
Embrace an abundance mindset, right? It's all about demand because replication costs, personalization cost is zero. In the data-driven paradigm, it's about demand, right? Embrace that. Forget the rest. Start from there.
Now, if there's one myth about disruption or digital transformation that you'd love to retire forever, what would that myth be?
The word transformation, because it's not an industrial caterpillar that will turn into a digital butterfly. Just forget that metaphor. Think about value creation paradigms, right? Like hunting, agriculture, industrial. Like if we go back to the last three paradigms, like the first three paradigms, right? We had hunting, and then we transitioned as a species to agriculture, and then we transitioned to the industrial age. These are three separate paradigms. Like you don't try to say, let's transform this hunter-gatherer into a farmer, right? You don't say, let's transform the farmer into an industrial business. It doesn't make any sense. So like these are three separate patterns, and you can own all three, like, you can create value in all three of these, right? If it's relevant for your customers, but like treat it from that perspective. Stop trying to transform stuff. You cannot transform stuff.
That's cool. And then what's next for you, my man? Any projects, anything that you're excited about for 2025?
I think with this book, what is crystallized is like my mission is really to prevent this high failure rates, in this quote unquote digital transformations. They have, failure rates of 90% or so, right? And that's just unacceptable. And legacy business is just getting crushed. I mean, you see that. Look at the Russell index, which has mainly legacy businesses. If you see that in the public markets around the world, if you look at the private markets, you don't have as much data, but you see legacy businesses are getting crushed everywhere. And not because they're not critical, they're super critical to our lives, right? We can't eat, wear, or live in software, right? Software has a role, right? But like we need these atoms businesses around us, these physical businesses.
Absolutely.
And we need them to win. And we need them to win not by transforming into like bits businesses, right? Or like, or being like software businesses. We need them to...
Yeah, I don't want to sit on a digital couch.
There you go. Right? I don't want to... And like the joke when this whole metaverse and all of this started was like the homeless person sitting under a bridge when it's raining, looking at their phone saying, oh, but I own a penthouse in the metaverse. Yeah, great. But you're freezing under the bridge, right? And so I think what we shouldn't forget in all of this is like, there are very fundamental things that are critical to our lives, that are critical to our societies, that are critical to our economy. And we need to let and make these people win too, right? And I think a lot of backlash, a lot of problems, a lot of inequality is driven by this, right? It's like not understanding how value creation works in these paradigms and not leveraging it correctly and not leveraging your unique unfair advantage, right?
Well, the Wall Street darlings have always been for quite some time have been the techs, because as you said, there's no cost of replication. And the younger generations draw to a technology space, especially after the lockdowns happened and people were drawn to just being on computers all the time. The idea of IRL, which is in real life, became almost secondary to the digital experience. And I think what you're saying is the importance of really honing in on winning in IRL is picking up this book, Data Impact, How Legacy Business Save, Leverage, Align, Simplify, Optimize, Grow to Win is what they need to do.
Yeah, exactly. Look at the travel industry after the lockdown. It's booming around the world. Look at airline prices. I mean, like last flights I took, the prices were twice as much as before the pandemic. And what that shows is we're still live, we're beings that live in the physical world, right? We're not living in the metaverse.
It's so true. And I go into the trade shows. I was just at GrowthCon with Grant Cardone. It was packed. I was at Keller Williams family reunion, just jammed with a lot of people. People want to get together. People need people, and we're not going to replace people today. And man, it's been amazing insights. For everyone listening, your challenge this week is identify one gap in your market, one place where demand is underserved, and start building a strategy to own it. And Rittavan, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast, my friend.
Thank you, Steve. It was great being here. And I really hope our listeners implement this, right? This book is not, I didn't write this book because I wanted to write a book. I wrote this book to change stuff in the real world, right?
Well, I think, one of the things it does is it really hones in on the idea of the importance of principles. And these are rock solid principles that I think you put forth. And I think it really allows people to then implement those through the very specific mechanics that they have in their business to become successful.
Yeah, I
So
try to
Rittavan,
provide you. Yeah, when the fog lifts, right? I'm trying to lift the fog, like to clear the fog, right, and give you clarity. And when you have clarity, and I try to give you, and that brings me to what I'm planning to do now, right? I'm trying to build an online community with the right resources, etc. Because as you know, as human beings, it's not just about knowing what's right, right? It's not just about clarity. It's about doing the thing, and doing the thing is only possible if you have other people who are trying to do the thing too, right? And so I think with the book. And again, that's multiple paradigms. The book is an industrial paradigm product. I'm trying to build a digital data-driven product where people who are trying to implement these ideas can come together, support each other, peer learning, all the other resources I can provide, so that we hit the ground right running. We really need to implement this to achieve impact. Clarity plus courage equal to impact, right? You need to get both of these together.
clarity, courage, impact. I love it, my friend. And guys, this is the money. This is the mindset. This is the mentoring podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you on the next one.